So just by a quick show of hands, how many in the audience here today operate grain dryers? Okay, great. How many of you track the efficiency of your grain dryer? You know, bushels per hour, efficiency, whatsoever. Okay, good. So what I'm going to talk about today, hopefully will maybe provide you with some tips, some techniques, and maybe some tools that you can use, you can take back to your facilities to really try to drill in on the cost to operate a dryer, the efficiencies, and more importantly, hopefully maybe for you to find a way to generate some income in your business. I've been reading, since my retirement, been reading lots of articles. You know, you just once you get out of agriculture, you just don't not read anything. And I read about how tough it's been the last year or so in particular for grain companies to make money. The margins haven't been there. You know, the carry hasn't been in the market. Everybody's carrying these monstrous inventories. So what are some other things that you might be able to do at your facility to generate income? And I'd like to suggest to you that managing your dryer could do that. So we're going to talk about ways we can generate income, talk a little bit about various dryer types. Won't spend a lot of time on them. Utilities. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but utilities generally represent 80 to 90% of your total cost per dryer. Okay? So if you can manage your utilities, understand what's going on in your utilities, maybe your rate schedules, you could help yourself. Tracking dryer performance. You know, what's actually going through the dryer? Do you track it? How can you track it? We'll talk about some things. Dryer selection spreadsheet. I've got an example up there that if you're looking to purchase a dryer, some suggestions that I have, okay, that you may be able to use. My favorite thing, does a half a point really make a difference? Some of you may have seen some of my earlier presentations at Jeeps on managing shrink. Okay? And half a point is depending on how much grain you handle through your facility, could make a large difference. And lastly, we'll talk about dryer shrink. So this is just kind of a 10,000-foot view of how we make money in the business, right? I've kind of put it into two basic categories. Put through, which is just, you know, you buy grain and you sell grain. Okay, you buy it at 10 under, you sell it at 5 over, you make 15 cents. Put through, margin on sales and purchases. I put dryer income in there as a way that you can also have a place to generate income. Space income would be things that you get from your customers relative to storage in space, basis appreciation spreads. Other income sources in the business, quality charges, okay, blending, bagging and cleaning, miscellaneous, crop insurance, marketing fees. Big thing that's been going on the last, 10, 15 years seems to be point trading, where the grain never really hits your facility. Your merchandiser buys it from point A and they deliver it to point C, and you're in the middle and you never see it at all. So what is it about drying that gives you some opportunities? Well, first of all, I would suggest that the grain dryer is one of the few pieces of equipment that you have in your facility that you can actually impact the quality of the product coming out of your facility. You've heard a lot of these, the panel talk about how important moisture is, how important grain quality is, how it ties to safety. Okay, so operating your dryer, it has a lot of opportunities, I think, out there. So you can look at drying charges should, hopefully, exceed cost. Sometimes those are market driven. As you well know, if your competition down the road has a cheaper drying rate than what you have, and the customer goes there, you may have to drop your drying rate just to be competitive. Okay. Drying to semi-wet or blend against overdry. You heard our panel up here talking about blending. Okay. When I was with the Andersons, we had a general, maybe it was more than general, guideline that we wouldn't blend greater than 2 points on either side of the target moisture. So the target moisture was 15.5, and I'm talking about corn in particular here, that's kind of king in most of the country. 15.5, we would blend 17.5% moisture with 13.5% moisture to come to a blend of 15.5. That would be the extreme. So we wouldn't be blending 22% moisture corn with dry corn to come up with 15.5. Just understanding the process, of course, gets you the ability to have an opportunity. Prevent overdrive. How many of you here, when you look at your dryer, I know some of you track it, so when you look at your dryer reports, how many times is the grain coming out of the dryer, is it too dry? Do you find that happens at your operation, or do you find it the other way? Anyone? Both? Okay. All right. Drying, review utility rates and structures. You could also use it as an opportunity to upgrade to energy efficient dryers. If you've got an old dryer that's been around and maybe 20, 30 years old, there's many of them in the countryside. First of all, you want to find out how efficient that dryer is before you try to justify the new purchase. But many of the new dryers that are out there today are energy efficient, both in their use of dryer fuel and horsepower and total energy. And of course, some other opportunities might be dryeration, and lastly, installing controllers. So why do we dry? We've heard it since this morning. Nick was talking about it. We want to reduce the moisture to improve the ability to keep the grain both short and long term. We have to get that moisture level down to an acceptable level. Now, what's acceptable would depend on your temperatures and your appetite for risk. I manage facilities where we would regularly dry corn out of the dryers and shove it into steel tanks with good air at 18 to 20% moisture. Okay? Now, you have good cooling and you can get it cooled down. You can maintain it for a long time. But you're not going to shove 20% moisture corn hot out of the dryer and put it into a bin that has marginal aeration and hope to have any success with that. Next would be to service the customer, or more particularly, meet customer expectations or contract specifications. You might have some customers that don't want, some of the food grade plants that I managed for a while, we had customers who wanted no corn greater than 14 on moisture. None. Almost to the point where they would almost use a single kernel moisture analyzer to know what the level of the moisture in those kernels were so that they knew that they had a good, stable, dry product. And other opportunities could be, reduce odors, right? Retard molds and mycotoxins. I kind of italicized retard, not reduce or get rid of. And of course, if you're operating a processing plant for soybeans or something, you might be drying the beans quick to shock them so you can get the hulls off and so forth. Several types of dryers. We'll go through this rather quick. Natural in the field. Aeration, where you're actually using the actual aeration of your bins. Low temperature, minimal outside heat source. Solar, fuel-fired could be. Most generally used in the industry, of course, is our high temperature natural gas. Natural gas, propane, wood, fired with wood, organic materials like rice hulls, corn cobs. There's just all kinds of things you can do that with. Two primary types, batch and continuous flow. That's not rocket science there. Generally, dryers are classified by the direction of the airflow versus the grain. At least that's what I've been taught, and maybe I'll get corrected here today. But we're going to look at a few, I think 3 or 4 basic types. Concurrent flow, where the airflow is concurrent, stays concurrent with the grain stream all right through. Mixed flow, that's kind of what it says. The flow is mixed, where you have the air going with the grain and across the grain stream. Cross flow, forced cooling. You see many of these on smaller farm setups, but they're also in commercials as well. This is probably one of the more popular brands of the cross flow dryer with reverse flow cooling, power dryers that we see across the countryside. Here's some quick snapshots of a typical cross flow. I think this has a pointer. Yeah. Your burners here pulling the cool air in, the fans, I should say, up across the burners, up into the plenum area, forcing the warm air out, hot air, I should say, out across the grain. Most of them look similar from the outside, but there's many differences in them as well, and I won't get into that. But many of them are defined by their actual system at the bottom on how they're emptied, the type of dryer they may be. Here's an example of a mixed flow dryer. where you can see that the grain is coming down in a column, but the air is also coming with the grain and going out through it. All right. Two basics of drying, at least that I would boil it down for me. The sooner you get the commodity to safe storage, moisture, and temperature, the deterioration process is slow. You've heard that consistent all the way through today, from this morning until our earlier speakers. You need to get that moisture level down and get the temperature to acceptable levels in order to be able to store it for any period of time. Your drying really depends on the ability of the air to evaporate water. Relative humidity, airflow, and temperature are the three key factors in this process. There are other factors, okay, such as the drying temperature, okay, the temperature you want to dry at. Here I talk a little bit about for seeds, your plenum temperatures, which I'll show you a chart for plenum temperatures, and also for on some corn dryers, you may see them get as high as 200 to 220 degrees. In general, the higher the temperature, the greater the potential for damage. You can imagine that kernel that is coming down inside the dryer at, I don't know, pick a number, 25% moisture. The moisture, if it's straight out of the field, is probably pretty much uniform within that kernel. Okay. Once that hot air hits that kernel, it starts to release the moisture, and where it releases the moisture is on the underneath the pericarp. I'll talk about corn, and it starts to come out through there. Okay, but it pulls out the moisture that's on the outside of the kernel more quicker, I should say, more expedient than it does otherwise. But if you do that too fast, it cracks. You get hairline cracks throughout the kernel. And high temperatures in particular, anyone that's operated a dryer through one of those years when you really were pushed, high run and high temperatures, and you know quickly when you see the fines line, when you get ready to hard a bin, or maybe if you don't hard it, you maybe find out later what kind of damage is done. I put this here, grain kernel temperature chart. I won't spend a lot of time on it. You know, this is kernel temperature now. This is not plenum temperature, which we'll talk about in a second. Actual kernel itself. So low temperature for seed, which would make sense. Human food grade in that 100 to 120. And you can see 120 to 140 animal food grade, full nutrition. Once you get over those temperatures, you start to degrade the actual, the value of that kernel. All right, and you get up to some temperatures, 160 and above, severe damage, physical breakage, test weight loss, and eventually discoloration, and so on and so forth. Here's what I mentioned about maximum plenum temperatures. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you just kind of pick your dryer, take a continuous flow dryer, corn, 200 degrees. I know of operators that sometimes run their plenums at 210, 220, during gut slot harvest when things are really, really backed up in the trucks and you're trying to get corn shoved out of there. Just have to recognize that doing that, you have the potential for an impact on the quality side. Other variables to be considered during the drying process is the cleanliness of the grain. If you have the ability to clean the grain prior to it going into the dryer, you have an opportunity to do a better, more uniform drying process. Okay? Some facilities have installed scalpers where they scalp the grain to get off the large pieces that don't maybe plug up your screens and shifters and so forth in the dryer. But also having the grain clean allows for better airflow, which allows you to do a better uniform job of drying. Kernel size, operating conditions, of course, temperature and humidity have an impact, airflow rates, and I put this in and underlined it, the cleanliness of the screens. We found many, many years ago when I was an active employee that the outside of the dryer, you would see them get built up, particularly on the tower dryer, and I'm not picking on towers, you'd see them get built up with this large, just god-awful red bees wing, dirt, dust that's hung on the outside. And we found that if we didn't get that cleaned off, the actual performance of the dryer dropped because we were tracking performance, okay? but you could tell that you had to slow the feed rate down for the same moisture to try to get, to get it through there. So on many of the dryers we actually installed, and I'll show you later, we installed, a pipe running up on the outside, and we could hook up a pressure washer, and while the dryer was operating, we pressure washed the outside of the dryer. We cleaned it up, and it improved the actual performance of that dryer. Here, I mentioned about just where is the plenum. So it's above this heating chamber. Okay, this is I couldn't find a better picture. This is one that I've had for quite a while, but you can see anything from this heating chamber from this level right here and up would be the heated plenum, and anything, of course, you can see where the cool air is pulled in. And this is with the typical tower dryer that you would see in operation across the U.S. So why is knowing your dryer important? Cost. You can use it to establish your own dryer. How much should you charge the customer? What do you need to cover those costs? You could use it to justify upgrades, to efficiency. I had a couple examples. Unfortunately, in my career, I had an opportunity to do that, to replace a couple of really old, antiquated, crease, about early 60s dryers, because of the efficiencies. And what we did was we tracked the actual performance of those dryers and used that then to justify the cost of new ones. Compare operating costs across facilities or regions. You may work in a company where you have different regions, different facilities. You want to be able to track and see what those costs might be. Allow you to, gain an advantage over a competitor, and really basically to understand your operation and the impact of operating your dryer on shrink, quality, storability, and more. Just all those pieces, trying to pull that together. So what I'm going to talk about now is I'm going to kind of get into over what I've talked about over the years. I'm fortunate enough that the Grain Elevator Managers course that's held at Kansas State, I participate with Carl Reed, and I do a whole half-day presentation on just managing your dryer. So I've kind of boiled this down, and I'm going to skim over some things, but I'll gladly, afterwards talk to anyone who'd like any more. But we're going to talk about these three primary efficiency measurements, and maybe you can take those back to your facility that you might be able to use to see how your dryer is actually doing. How is it performing? So the first one, we all talk about that, right? Bushels per hour. I know the guys that are on the floor that are here, Chief, GSI, Brock, we'll probably forget somebody, Mega, all your major dryer manufacturers. If I forgot someone, I apologize. Okay, I'm not omitting you for any reason. But we talk about bushels per hour. I want a 10,000 bushels an hour. I want a 12, or I want an 8, or whatever that might be. But that's one of the defining things and that's also one of my efficiency measures. You want a dryer that's going to do what it says it's going to do. Cost per point of moisture removed. How much does it actually cost you in labor, materials, energy, all of those pieces? How much does it cost you to remove 1 point of moisture from corn, beans, or wheat? You can measure any grain that you want. Okay. By kind of taking what I'm going to show you here in a little bit and transferring it to your facility. And so if you want to dry canola, you could do that with canola. It's just going to be a little bit different because I've been used to drying corn, beans, and wheat. And last but not least, actually my number one is an efficiency measure is the BTU per pound of water removed. How efficient is that dryer in removing water from the grain? I've seen some dryers, some old antiquated dryers that would run close to 3,000 BTU per pound of water removed. That's just a number right now to you, but I can tell you that some of the more efficient dryers I've seen will run in the 1,800 to 2,000, sometimes less than that, BTU per pound of water removed. And when you think about that, fuel, dryer fuel in particular, is 75, 80, 90% of your total cost. That's really where the efficiency measure comes in, how efficient that dryer is. Some of your dryer manufacturers publish that information. I'm guessing that most of them know that information if you ask that. Okay? And it would be one of my questions if I were buying a dryer. I'd want to know, one, how fast is it? What do you think it's going to cost me to remove 1 point of moisture? But more important, how efficient? Because typically, and I may point this out a little bit later, maybe once or twice in our career, we might have an opportunity to replace a dryer. So the decisions you make could be with you for a long time. Now, this morning I was talking with Jim Boyd, who was at ADM for a number of years. They had 400 locations, and he was buying 30 to 40 dryers a year. Okay, so there you have a lot of opportunities. But if you happen to be at a company where maybe you only have 30 locations or 50 locations, you think about how often you get a chance to purchase a dryer. Those decisions that you make are pretty important. Cost to dry components, energy cost, as I mentioned, generally between 80 and 90%, could be more, okay, depending on your fuel. And you'll see I've got some comparisons here between some primary fuel sources. Maintenance costs, if you have a fairly new dryer, the maintenance costs probably are not that high. But if you have old dryers that need a lot of work, every year you're replacing screens or sections in them, those things add up over a period of time. Labor costs, this is not only labor costs to do the maintenance, but also inefficient, slower dryers take more time to dry your product, therefore your labor costs are up and so forth. Fixed costs such as depreciation, taxes, and insurance, in my spreadsheets that I'll share with you, I don't track those fixed costs. We knew what those costs were, and we calculated those costs, but we didn't put them in as part of the cost to dry. Okay? Thought this might be interesting. Maybe it isn't. This is for 1 million BTUs. Okay. So natural gas, which most of us are familiar with, 1 MCF, 10 therms, or 1,000 cubic feet, which is 1 million BTU. If you're in Brazil and you need to run your dryer and you don't have natural gas and you don't have propane, you probably are using wood. And that takes about, 286 pounds of wood for 1 million BTU. And I've seen pictures of these dryers operating with wood, okay, rice hulls and so forth. But the biggest comparison I think you want to take a look at is natural gas, propane, and fuel oil. Those three right there tend to be the most generally used in this country. And you can see it takes about 11 gallons of propane to get 1 million BTUs and about a little over 7 gallons of number 2 fuel oil for 1 million BTUs. This is some data that I just got not long ago. I went out and took a look, and I've got some charts here to show you. Natural gas prices in the U.S. are at historic lows. They're almost giving it away. Not quite, okay, but far better than it was a number of years ago. Okay? But you can see an MCF of natural gas is about $1.92. That same 1 million BTUs of propane, about $5.50, and this is wholesale. Okay? I don't know what you're paying when you at your burner tip. Probably for natural gas, I would say generally I would double that. For once you had delivery charges and those kind of things added in. So propane, you could maybe use that same analogy. And fuel oil, if you're burning fuel oil, I think it's kind of salty, on your cost to dry. So you might want to take that into consideration. Now, you may not have natural gas at your facility, and it's 25 miles away. Well, I wouldn't expect you to run a pipeline and just to do that, but this would give you some indication of the comparison of those fuels. This is chart from 1997. I hope your eyes are better than mine because it looks a little blurry. But from 1997, you can just see some historical information. And you look here in 2005. I remember that year in particular, but 2005, you can see this jump in the natural gas prices. There's almost $12, and these are Henry Hub prices. These are at a pricing point, almost like Chicago Board of Trade. Henry Hub's a pricing point. So that doesn't include delivery to your burners yet, okay? You're going to pay someone on top of that. So we had some really phenomenal gas prices back then. But you can see here in 2016, gas costs are still relatively cheap, and they have been here for a number of years. You know, natural gas, we're very fortunate to have that in this country. Heating oil versus propane. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on this, but you can see this compares residential and wholesale. But you can see here back in, what is that, the end of March, first part of April, you can see these are wholesale pricing of heating oil and propane. I always find it interesting that on this, wholesale propane is about 51 cents, and your residential is about 4 times that. That's the marketplace. Heating oil historically, not a lot to be learned from that. Electric rates. Electric rates vary widely depending in what state you operate in. Okay. And the kind of rate structure, which we'll talk about briefly, can also have an impact. So what I tried to do was pick a few states: Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota. And you just kind of look across, and you can see here, these are the average. These are residential, commercial, industrial, and then all sectors. I would imagine that most of you fall into commercial or industrial, okay? But you might want to just make sure you take a look to make sure what rate schedule you're actually on. Is the elevator that you're operating or the facility that you're operating, are they on the correct schedule? Or are they on the same schedule they had 25 years ago before you upgraded the plant? That could have a major impact on that as well. While living in Hawaii is beautiful, what is that, 37 cents? Yeah, 37 cents a kilowatt hour. So, but you don't need much over there besides some air conditioning and a bottle of beer on the beach, right? Additional utility considerations. Are you on the right schedule, as I mentioned? You want to take a look at that both for electric and gas. I'm aware in some states where gas is deregulated, you can buy gas and transport it. You can anytime you want, if you use enough gas, you can hedge futures. You can buy futures, okay, to hedge against future costs. I'm not suggesting that you want to do that this year because it looks like it's pretty stable. There's no forecast for any big jump in it. But you may want to consider that in future years, particularly if there's volatility in the market. Some of these utility considerations actually, they may limit your usage. I helped manage a facility a number of years ago where if the temperature dropped below, I think it was something like 28 degrees or 30 degrees, they had the right to shut us off. Well, that's okay unless you're trying to dry an inventory of 2 million bushels of wet corn, right? So you just hope that it doesn't get that cold. But it was a great utility rate. It was really cheap, but you may get caught on that too. So, some states do not charge sales tax on fuel used in processing. I personally know this in Indiana, where I worked for a number of years. Indiana has no sales tax on fuel used for processing, and drying grain was considered to be processing. So that's 7% right there that you can just take off your bill, right away. And you had to watch it because even though you had that exemption, maybe the next year your gas company would suddenly look at your bill and say, "Oh, they're charging me tax again." And then you'd have to reapply for the tax, abatement on it, but you would get it off. So you might want to check in your state. You may have the ability to. That 7%, it adds up, particularly if you're doing a lot of drying. Some facilities have to deal with electrical demand. Anybody in here have a demand factor that they have to deal with at your facility? Yeah. Wow, that can add up. A number of years ago, one of the facilities that I managed, our actual kilowatt per hour charge in the rate schedule was 5.5 cents. But once they added the demand portion, and we had a lot of horsepower, and you're bringing in a lot of horsepower at one time and all that kinds of stuff, our average cost per kilowatt hour was 12 cents. Better than double the actual cost. So demand, and I'm not an electrician or a scientist by trade, but basically it's how much power do you pull in. They measured it, I think, in maybe 15-minute windows. Does that sound right, Don? 10 or 15-minute window?
Some places just do it on a peak. What's the biggest peak during the day?
So if you go out and start all your, you start up your legs, and you start up your conveyors, you start up your dryer, you go to load, you do all that stuff, and you pull in, 1,200 horsepower. There's a peak that the utility sees and it says, that's how much you want to use, you're going to pay for it. Okay? So you could be on a demand. And I'm sure if you're looking at your utility bills, you probably already know that. Okay? But just be aware of that could have a major dramatic impact on your cost as well. So. And I've got another slide here, but newer style energy efficient motors can and do make a difference. And here you can see just a comparison. I didn't fill it. All I filled in was the blocks, and it calculated it for me. So if this isn't accurate relative to today, this was a suggested, energy efficiency was already in there. But you can see just alone on 400 horsepower. With today's bigger dryers, it doesn't take anything to get 400 horsepower. Okay. But at 400 horsepower, a 27% increase between an old new motor, a new style motor, the kilowatt usage, and the old style motor. You multiply that times it's not just your dryer that's operating, it's your cost of the other equipment, the legs, conveyors, all those things, which you'll see in the form that I've got here coming up the spreadsheet. We actually track those as well. So you can actually track bushels through the dryer if you install some kind of a mechanism. I don't care, electrical, mechanical. I've seen simple ones where every time the rotor turned on the bottom of the Barrico dryer, it clicked off one. Okay. I've got a slide in here of an older Zimmerman dryer that we've got the gearbox outside feeding in through to the gearbox inside, and we put a counter on there so it would count the revolutions. Okay. And I'll explain a little bit more, but you can do that if you just count the unload system. Okay. If you come up with some mechanism to track that unload system. Perform some tests with dry, stable grain. You probably want to do that, now or sometime before you're going to use your dryer. I wouldn't suggest doing it during harvest because it's a cumbersome thing to do. Tracking it during harvest is one thing. Trying to get to the point where you can use the information is another. Okay? Weigh the bushels out of the dryer for the greatest accuracy. And I'll go through a quick example of that, and you'll see about that. Run multiple tests. And I say this, the goal is to gain a level of confidence in your bushels per count. So in the example I used of the Barrico dryer that's got a little airlock down at the bottom, or a screw, whatever that might be, that's operating, you would count the revolutions. Okay? And for X many revolutions, if you weighed up the grain at the other end, you would come up with 1,000 bushels, and you had 1,000 counts, 1 bushel per count. You'd run those tests multiple times so that you get to the point where you had a comfort level to say it's actually 1.1 bushels per count, or it's 5 bushels. And every dryer is different. Every dryer is different. They have different unload systems. So you have to look at the unload system in particular. And with today's newer dryers, they actually on the variable speed drives, you actually have an output there that you can pick up some kind of a pulse from there that will tell you how many revolutions, and you could maybe divide by 100 and get that, work that backwards. Okay. You'll see why that's important. And I would also suggest that you test it annually because the crops do change. Growing conditions have an impact. So you want to You want to do that on an annual basis. The more you test, the more, over the years, the more confidence you will have in your numbers. This is going to sound and feel, maybe to some of you, as overkill. You know, it's just, what do I need all of this information for? Well, I came from a company where they manage their books on a gross house. Okay? Gross house means you put all the bushels into the book, okay, and then the operations manager, Don or Jeff, he would have to calculate dryer shrink, turn that into the accounting department, and they would subtract it off the books. Okay? That's a gross house. Most of your net houses say you brought in 1,000 bushels of wet grain. It's really only 850, and you only put 850 in the book. And they don't ask you to track the shrink. Okay? I came from an organization that we tracked every shrink: dryer shrink, aeration shrink, mechanical shrink, mixing shrink. How many more were there? And then it went on forever. Okay, but so that's why it was important to go through this process. Here's an example of a dryer counter. It was on an old Zimmerman dryer. Here you can see, and no, I'm not the start of these Zimmerman, good dryer. The gearbox, the shaft going into the, and let me see if you can, there's a little shoe that's going by a proximity sensor. It's just picking up a count. Okay? And that count would be sent to a totalizer. Right? And this totalizer, we would start in the morning with the totalizer at 0. And it would sit there and count. This actually counted one of 10. So every 10th actual revolution, it only counted 1. Okay? You can set that up depending on how fast your system operates. So you would take that, and this would be the total for the day. Okay? So the test guidelines would basically be this. Use dry grain, fill the dryer to the top, reset the counter to 0. Okay, you want to start at 0. No heat's required for this test. You aren't testing anything except now we want to find out how much grain is going through there in a certain amount of time. Set the feed rate close to normal operational speeds. I mean, if your dryer normally runs in 60% feed rate or whatever that is, set it at that and operate it. This says for at least a half an hour. Longer is better. And just run the dryer, no heat, don't need any fans. Okay? Just run the grain through the dryer into hopefully a scale, if you can, or into a small bend that you can accurately measure, so that at the end of this test, and you follow there, you want to make sure the columns are all feeding right and all that kind of stuff. At the end of the test, you can measure the amount of grain that's in this bin, or you've weighed it, and you've kept track of the counts, right? And then that allows you to come back to get to bushels per count. So, and because what we're going to do, what I'm going to show you is that I don't really care what the wet bushels were that went into the dryer. I can help you calculate that. As long as I know what the dry bushels were coming out, and the moisture going in and the moisture going out, we can calculate what went into the dryer. Okay. This is one way to do that, and it's a little more realistic than trying to track. Well, I put 20,000 bushels of wet corn in that bin, and that all went into the dryer. I've seen truck depth operators. But anyway, so. Sampling. Now this holds true. You don't have to do this during your test. Okay, you can if you want. It's not really important. This is really a sampling procedure when your dryer is operating. Okay. I would recommend that you take samples every half an hour at the dryer. What that does mean, guys and ladies, is that you don't just start the dryer and walk away. Somebody is managing that dryer. Somebody's watching that dryer. Now, they don't have to be there 24/7, but as important as this piece of machinery is to your business, you probably ought to be paying close attention to it. Okay? Make sure you use a properly calibrated moisture meter. I couldn't tell you how many places I've been where they take the oldest junk piece of moisture meter, set it in the back room, put it out in the dryer. and tell the guy to run it. Take it, use the same one you use at your inspection. Same one you're buying the grain off of. Use that as what the actual moisture was coming in and out of the dryer. Take both samples of wet and dry grain going into and coming out of the dryer. So theoretically, if you were doing it every half hour, if you think that's overkill, do it every hour, okay? You would have two samples, one wet sample, one dry sample. And lastly, I would recommend and suggest that you can bag the samples and run the moisture the next day. You can look at what your dryer is putting out. Many of them have dryer controllers. Okay? You can look at what's going on there, but that sample that you just pulled out of the dryer when it's actually running, okay, needs to set. Needs to equilibrate. I think that's the right word I've got. It needs to, the moisture that was deep inside that kernel needs to work itself back out. And there will be a difference. And that's what we would use for dryer shrink calculation. Now, if you're not that interested in it, I guess that's another thing. But if you're really interested in finding out what your dryer does, that's what you do. Yes?
How much difference would you see from if you ran it?
Sometimes a half point, sometimes 6/10. I mean, it varied on how wet the grain was going in and what kind. There's some variables in there, but I would say a half point. Yeah. You'll see it a little bit later here how half point makes a difference. Other suggested guidelines: keep the plenum temperature as low as possible and control your output. If you can dry at 180 and run it at 85%, that would be better than or run it at 60%, I should say, and still keep up. Okay, it's better than to run it at 220 degrees and just go like a bat. So 10 minutes. Thank you. Clean the exterior and interior of the dryer when any material is evident. Consider a two-pass operation. If you have the space and the ability to run it through the dryer, put it out into the tank. Hopefully, you've got the ability to bring it back up, in a timely fashion. Running corn out at everybody has their level of comfort around this, but I would have the experience with running corn out at 18 to 20%. Knocking it off, putting it in the tank, and bringing it back up, 3, 4, 5 days later, a week later. Keep an eye on your temperatures. Okay? There's a way to help yourself out of this process. You can improve and also improve the quality. Consider drying to semi-wet. Company I work for, we spend a lot of time learning about storing semi-wet grain. And you heard our panelists talking about how long you can keep it. We would put away semi-wet grain in the fall and still be blending some of that off coming June, July of next year. Now, have I ever had problems with it? Yes. Okay. So everything comes with some risk, but there's a way to manage through that. Make sure each column is feeding uniformly. Use dry aeration. I put up here AE 106 Purdue University, Midwest Planning Service. You go there, you can get their bulletin on dry aeration, where you actually run the corn out of the dryer as hot as possible. If you can run full heat, put it into a bin with air on it. Okay, leave the air off, let it sit there and steep for. They have a recommended period of time. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to 24 hours, and then turn the fans on, blow that out, and you might gain yourself a point and a half, maybe 2 points, depending on what you're doing there. It could improve the put through to the dryer, take some of the pressure off of you having to keep raising the plenum temperature, when you're trying to dry. Hidden costs of lower efficiencies, additional labor hours and overtime, more space when needed for wet grain, quality issues, and maybe number one is less than desirable customer service. Gas train, throttle, just make sure you get these inspected annually. I just put this in here. We had an issue one time where this little set screw came loose. The main gas valve went wide open. The controller said, "Hey, you need to shut it back." Guess what? It was trying to shut it back, but the gas valve was wide open. And fortunately, the temperature sensor shut it down before we had a fire. But three primary dryer files: dryer daily log, dryer shrink, and the cost to dry. So here's just a simple log. You know, you could use it to dryer. The dryer operator can fill it out, hourly, wet sample, dry sample, and so forth. That kind of information. This is just a simple Excel spreadsheet. Dryer shrink and performance. So this would be the supervisor or manager, maybe in your case. You would use this here where you can see here you have bushels per count. Then you enter that information, and it calculates everything out. I can show you the entire spreadsheet anybody wants afterwards, and I'd be willing to share that with you want. This is just an annual recap. And now we're really getting down to the cost to dry. Okay? So what you would look at is the wet bushels in, dry bushels out, how many bushels of shrink, pounds of water removed, percent of wet bushels removed, total points removed. You know, the big numbers are the gas. You can see $117, almost $118,000 of the 155 was just gas. And also in here is this efficiency measure right here of BTU per pound of water removed. This happens to be corn, beans, and wheat. You can change these columns to, you know, facility A, facility B, facility C, however you want to do it. You can modify that. Yes?
Are you tracking humidity outside and ambient temperature?
No. This is, admittedly, this is not as scientific as it could be. Right. Yeah. This is a dryer selection guide. I know my time is getting close. This is just a guide that I put together. I'd be willing to share with anybody, but it basically takes a look, and what this is looking at actually is three different types of dryer: cross flow, mixed flow, or concurrent flow. Maybe some of the things you might want to consider if you're looking at purchasing a dryer: the amount of horsepower that's being installed. You know, you're putting in a 10,000 bushel an hour dryer. There's a good chance you may have to upgrade your electrical. Okay, may put in a new substation. May be required to upgrade your gas service and all those kinds of things. There are other dryers out there. For instance, there's a mixed flow dryer that the horsepower is half of what the conventional tower dryer is. Okay? You may want to look at those kind of things when you're considering purchasing a dryer, because that can make a big difference, not only in your electrical and utility usage, but also what you're going to have to put into your infrastructure. Burners. You know, my favorite is, are the burners protected from fines and dust? How many in here have towel dryers? Okay. I mean, they're popular, they're great, but I'll tell you, it was always a job to keep those things clean. And you're in there drilling out the burners and that stuff. There's dryer manufacturers out there, most of them the concurrent flow, that actually the burners are not exposed to any of the fines. Not exposed to any fines, any dirt whatsoever. Okay. They're completely isolated because of their design. So you may want to consider that and take a look at that if you're looking for a dryer. Other criteria: do you need one large dryer or 2 units? I know when I was ops manager, I'd have given my left eye, I'd given my left eye, guys, to have a second dryer at harvest time. One that I could put the wet beans in, one the wet corn, and maybe it was a common system, okay, fill and dry system. But if I had the ability, I didn't have to switch back and forth. And you know what? When it got really hectic and I had to dry corn, they're both running corn. So you may want to consider that as in part of your criteria. Remember, bigger is not always better. Take a hard look at your operating costs and take a look at different types of dryers. Here again, mentioning some of the mixed flow units there. So what's water worth? 1 point of moisture of water. Today's corn prices at $3.50 is worth 4.2 cents a bushel. Wheat at 4.8, almost 5 cents, and soybeans at 12 cents a bushel. You over dry soybeans by 1 point, you lost 12 cents a bushel, easily, not including the cost to dry. Okay, you just lost maybe all the margin that you might have had in the first place. Okay, so water's worth a lot. It's also the one thing that kills us too. Too much water in there. It's really a razor's edge that you walk on operating as a manager. You don't want to get too dry, but yet you don't want to get too wet. You have to walk on that very gently. So does a half point really matter? And I'm going to zero in, and I'm going to stand off the side here so I'm not blocking you. But a half point of moisture, I'm going to take this example right here. This is 3.7 million, 3,750,000 bushels of dry grain. In this example, it went in at 21 and it came out at 15. These are averages, okay? And in this example, it went in at 21 and it came out at 14.5. Okay, a half point. That's all there is, just a half point difference. The difference between those two is almost 8,000 bushels of additional shrink. 8,000 bushels. I don't know about you, but 8,000 bushels at $4 a bushel is worth a vacation someplace, right? So your dryer operators, But here again, you have to make sure that you're careful with this. You don't want to, find yourself trying to just cut that edge too much, and then you end up with quality issues as well. But so a half point, and the more you dry, the bigger that difference gets to be. It can be very significant. Quick formula that I've used for a number of years. To calculate dryer shrink, very simply, it's the dry bushels, which you've counted coming out of your dryer. You know how much, what's come out of there, times the dry moisture from 100. So let's say it's 100 and it's 14.5 coming out, okay? So that would be dry bushels times 14.5 divided by the wet moisture minus 100, which in this case, let's say it was 20 going in, which is divided by 80 will equal your wet bushels. And I'll show you how that works out. Most of that we've already talked about. Book versus actual shrink factors, I think, is worth taking at least a second to talk about. Actual is somewhere around 1.2%. So if your company charges 1.4 for shrink, you've got a little bit of margin there. If they charge 1.7, you've got more margin. Okay, but in a dry year, that 0.2 might not be enough. You might come up short on your inventory. Unless you're tracking shrinks, this may not be enough, as I said there, between those two. So grain dryers, on my wrap-up, are a major source of cost and potential income. Okay? But you really need to be able to measure what's going on. You need to know what's coming out of your dryer so you can determine whether or not you're even charging enough to cover your costs. And maybe in the final analysis, your market conditions don't allow you to cover it, but you should at least know what it costs you to operate. Consider hedging your utility costs because it tends to be 90% of the process. And excessive moisture and shrink is controllable, and the value of that shrink could well exceed your margin. Now, these were study questions, but you don't have to answer them.